in the beginning, it's inevitable that you as an ego will seek to get free from yourself as an ego. That's the only possibility, because you start out, you start out as a personality in a body, right? But if you practice using breath work to calm down the system, to calm down the autonomic nervous system, and if you practice meditation and you do it every single day, eventually the fact that you're still in the identity of the personality, right, will give way, right? So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you try and answer that question. There's no way to answer that question, right? You're either aware of yourself as awareness, or you're the personality attempting to be aware of yourself as awareness, right? But if you do the practices and you persist, it will inevitably weaken the identity of the ego. It will inevitably weaken the identity that you have taken yourself to be, and you'll start seeing the difference. You'll start seeing the difference. One of the ways that I talk about this all the time is to say, you'll start seeing the difference in terms of you're aware of anger instead of being angry. When you see that difference, now you recognize that there is a distinction you didn't have before about your anger. In the past, you were just trying not to be angry. This is what people do as a personality. If you go to psychotherapy, as a personality, you're trying to change the aspects of yourself as a personality that don't work. Nothing wrong with that, right? But it's not going to offer you a natural experience of well-being. It can't do that. It can only allow you to get better at an improved version of yourself as a personality, right? But it still leaves you without the experience of well-being, meaning the experience of feeling satisfied, content, at ease, and at peace. You can't do that, right? But if you do these practices, that's one of the reasons that I say here, I kind of say it kiddingly, but people who, when you come to this class, you're coming on a regular basis, right, to weaken your personality. That's why you're coming. Right? And the personality that you're trying to weaken, right, will have you not come. Yeah. The people that aren't here have a reason not to be here. That happened in their head. And when that reason happened in their head, right, they were in the default state. They were thinking they thought that thought. Therefore, the weather is not too nice. It's a little colder today. It was even snowing, so I better stay home. If you think you thought that thought, you have no option. You have to stay home. But if you get to a point through these practices, right, where you recognize, right, that I am the awareness of this thought activity, I am not the thinker of these thoughts. Once that starts to happen, then you start to come into reality. You start to experience things as they are, which is that the voice in your head is not you. That's experiencing things as they actually are, that the voice in your head is not you. That doesn't mean that you never follow it. No, what it means is you pay attention to it so that when it is being impractical, when it is being unrealistic, you no longer identify with that. Right? You still use it instead of having it use you. You still use it to think practical things, right? That's the thing about it that makes it so confusing for people. My personality occurs in my thought activity. So how do I deal with this? Do I try to stop thinking? Do I try not to ever think? No, that's not going to work. No. So how do I deal with this? The way I deal with this is that I start practicing being aware of thinking instead of being the thinker of the thoughts. When you're practicing meditation, that's literally what you're doing if you're doing it correctly. You're letting go of your identification with thinking. So that thinking still happens, right? But it's no longer what you're following. I was talking to somebody about this earlier today, And it's kind of like you're aware of thinking, but you're not paying attention to it. That's the distinction. You're still aware of it. You can be aware of things. You can be in a room and be aware of things, hearing things, right, that are happening outside the room, or maybe what the weather is or whatever. You can be in a room and be aware of things, but not be paying attention to those things. That's what you're doing in meditation. You know, you're moving your attention away from the thought activity. And when we do the practice of meditation, we say you're moving your attention away from the thought activity and being aware of the body breathing. It could easily seem as though what we're doing is trying to get away from thinking. But that's not what we're really doing when you're practicing meditation. What we're really doing is we're practicing being aware of our ability to be aware of something and not be paying attention to it. Because the fulfillment of the practice is that you're in your life, thinking continues to happen, okay? You're aware of the thinking just enough to know whether it's useful or not. If it's not useful, it's background. For most people, thinking is foreground. For most people, your personality is in front of the awareness. And when you talk to most people about the awareness, they say, this is how most people relate to awareness. I am aware. That's how they relate to awareness. I am aware. So they interject the identity before the awareness. I am aware. Right? And when you wake up and see things as they are, you realize that that's not the case at all. Awareness is here first, and then there's a personality. So when you say, I am aware, you're saying the personality has awareness. No, it doesn't. Personality doesn't have anything. You could say the personality is awareness, having taken the temporary form of a personality. That's why the name of the book that David wrote is A Temporary Affair. Because it's a temporary situation that the awareness has identified itself with a body and a personality for a temporary period of time. Another way of talking about this is to say, if you look at an actor, a good actor can get lost in the role they're playing. A good actor can study the character, really try and understand the way that character's mind worked, right? And if it's a really good actor, right, when they're playing the character, they're experiencing what it would be like to be that character. But they never stop knowing the truth. Do you understand this? They never stop knowing the truth. If you're a great actor, you can get lost in the role you're playing, but you never stop knowing the truth of who you are. If you did, you would become a mental illness case. Wouldn't you? You know, if an actor's playing a role in a movie, and after the movie's over, they keep thinking they're in the role, that's a mental illness, right? So this is kind of what it's like, is you're developing your ability to be an actor. You're acting as Frank. And there's never a moment that you don't know you're acting as Frank. Right? If you did think that you were Frank, really Frank, then you're subjected to everything about him. His fears, what makes him angry, what happened in his earlier life, what's going to happen in his later life, and he's going to end up dying. Right? But if you know you're just the actor acting as Frank, none of those things occur to you. None of those things are true. It's a shift. It's a shift out of that. And when you shift out of that, the way you begin to experience things, right, is that they lose their impact. Because you realize that happened to Frank. It didn't happen to the awareness. And since I always know that I'm always the actor acting as Frank and never Frank, I'm not experiencing the life of Frank. I'm experiencing the life of awareness. So that what happens in the life of Frank, right, I can say I was there for that, just like David Radin was sharing about having a stroke. He shares, I was there for that, but I wasn't disturbed by it because I wasn't being the person that would otherwise be upset about having a stroke. I was the awareness of the body, an awareness of the thought process that was occurring. So it's a different experience. It's a natural experience. It's a different experience. And you know all the time that the character that you're playing never actually existed. Just never actually existed. This is what we're getting to through practice. Is, you practiced your way into this trouble, you've practiced your way into this identity, right? And now you have to practice your way out of this identity. That's how this works. And you don't have to worry about, how do I know when I'm where I'm at? You don't have to worry about that. It'll take care of itself. If you do the practices and you persist and you make sure every day that you are spending some time exposing yourself to the truth teaching, whether it's through reading or whether it's through listening to somebody talk, that will weaken your identity. You ever notice, if you listen to David Radin, you ever notice if you listen to him talk, that after the talk there's a sense of relief? If you listen to a truth talk, after the talk there's a sense of relief, right? Because it's kind of tapping you on the shoulder and reminding you that you're in a dream. And when you realize that, you realize, oh, I can relax. This is just a dream. I just dreamed I was Frank. I'm not really Frank. You have that relief. You feel that relief, right? And then as time goes on and you interact with the world, right, the frankness starts to get heavy again. The frankness starts to come back, especially if you get provoked. If something stimulates a reaction like anger or fear, then the frankness gets very real, gets very real, contracts, gets very real. So if you understand this process, you understand that you have to actively be engaged with producing an alternative reality. That's what you're doing. As a personality, you're producing an alternative reality by practicing being who you really are. But you're still a personality. You're still a personality practicing being who you really are, right? But at some point through the practice, when the practice gets consistent enough and you've been doing it persistently long enough, right? At some point something shifts. Now it's the self experiencing itself, not the personality trying to be the self. You see what I'm saying? Do you understand what I'm saying? It doesn't matter the answer?
Yes, I do.
It doesn't matter. You don't have to figure this out. You don't have to analyze this. All you have to do is do the practice. The practice works. Because why does it work? Because the truth is true. That's why it works. You truly are what you are. That's why the practice works, because you're practicing, continuing to pay attention in such a way where you can see what's not real as not real. But even though that's the case, at another level, you recognize that the personality and the consciousness or the awareness are the exact same thing. That's why nothing has to change, right? Because the consciousness and your personality are the exact same thing. The consciousness is manifesting itself in the form of your personality. So even when you're in the middle of taking yourself to be the personality, you are the self. See, if you can really get that, if that can get through, that's the end. That's the cards will fall. When you realize you can't not be what you are. It's impossible. This is the way this is the way Paul Hederman talks about it. He says you can't get out of what you've never been in. That would be the personality, right? And you can't get into what you've never been out of. That would be yourself. See, if you could see that, you would realize that, you can relax. Because you're never not what you really are. You're never not what you really are. But you do have to pay attention to the mental activity, because that's where the trip is. You have to pay attention to the mental activity, because when you identify with the mental activity, you go to sleep and you start dreaming. So the key is, one way to say this is, the key is, can you stay awake? That's all. You're not trying not to dream, you're not trying not to dream, that's not possible, right? You're not trying not to dream, You're trying to be aware that you're dreaming when you're dreaming. That's all. You're trying to be aware that you're thinking when you're thinking, instead of getting lost and identifying with the thinking activity. Does that help?
Yeah, and sometimes when you do get lost, it happens so quickly. You don't realize you're in it. You know what I mean?
Until you're out of it again. That's right. That's right. You don't. That's the problem, that we're the condition that we're in. When it happens, you don't know that it happened. You don't know that it happened until you come out of it again and look back. That's why what Ramesh Balsekar is saying is so powerful, because at the end of the day, you look back at the day, you can see that there was nobody doing anything. There was an activity, mental activity occurring. That was all that was happening. You can see that. You can't see it as it's happening because you're in it. You're in it. When you're dreaming at night, you don't know you're dreaming. You have to wake up first, right? It's the same way with this. Yeah, when you're in a state, when you're in the condition, you don't know you're in the condition, right? You have to have an ability to wake up. When you first get exposed to these teachings, right? You get information about the possibility of a different existence. You get information about it, right? Once you have that information, you can now take that information and begin to look. And as you take that information and begin to look, at some point, there'll be a recognition that the awareness that you are can see what you're not. The awareness that you are can see the mental activity that's producing the illusion that you're a body and a personality. Once you can see that, it's just a matter of practice after that. It's just a matter of how much of the day, right, you're committing yourself to doing breath work, you're committing yourself to resting as awareness. And it's very important to understand, I was listening to Aji Shanti talk about this. When we say rest as awareness as a practice, that's not an activity. That's not an activity. When we say rest as awareness, that's not you're not doing anything when you rest as awareness. Being is not doing. When you're practicing meditation, you're not doing anything. That's why we talk about letting go. Letting go of what? The idea that you're going to do anything. You're just going to relax, let the body relax, let the mind calm down. Because what we're interested in experiencing is already happening. We just want to get the static out of the way so that experience can be readily available. That's all meditation is. Most people don't meditate because they think they're doing something, and that's not meditation. If you're doing something and you call that meditation, all you're doing is making the idea that you're the personality seem realer. You're just getting yourself deeper into the shit. That's all you're doing.